One of the sessions we followed at the recent World Economic Forum featured a panel that included IBM CEO Arvind Krishna and Arthur Mensch, the founder of Mistral AI, a French startup specializing in developing large language models, most of which are available open source. Almost at the same time that this panel was taking place, DeepSeek made front-page headlines and sent shockwaves through the global tech industry, grabbing the attention of major media outlets covering AI and innovation. DeepSeek is a large language model developed in China that reportedly outperformed ChatGPT. Not only that, it was also developed at a fraction of the cost of ChatGPT. For us, the news was even more striking because it felt like déjà vu. We had just listened to the wish list of IBM CEO and Arthur Mensch of Mistral AI on stage in Davos, and pretty much everything they wished became reality within just a few hours. When he left Google to start Mistral AI, Arthur Mensch had three main goals: to distribute a model that was open source, to provide an alternative to the models from big tech, to reduce the digital divide in society, and all of these at a much lower cost than the current large language models. Now, if we listen closely to what the founder of Mistral AI had to say, it almost sounds like the DeepSeek's manifesto. Take a listen.
But in many respects, the creation of Mistral was driven by an intention to make the technology more widely available and to also show that there was a counter model to the scaling approach, to it takes 100 billion to get their approach that has been promoted by some of our US friends. I think we need to make sure that the AI we're building, the industrial revolution that we're all building together, doesn't end up being controlled by free US players. Because if that's the case, the digital divide that we've been observing is just going to continue to grow. The GDP per capita will continue to grow. But the chance we have is that this is not such a costly technology to make. If you make the right choices, you can make sure that this is an innovation that can be much wider spread than the innovation that we've done in the previous cycles.
Within a few days from the DeepSeek release, the news reported that the Chinese startup basically used ChatGPT to create its own version, a procedure that is considered a copyright infringement, and therefore illegal. This news was also a déjà vu, as it came up much earlier during a different session about AI at the World Economic Forum. Take a listen.
So first of all, it's incredibly consequential, and I'll get into that. I do need to correct one thing. It was actually trained on just as much data as Llama, so about 15 trillion tokens, 14 trillion, somewhere in that neighborhood. What happened was DeepSeek used a smaller number of GPUs, about 2,000 for a little longer than normal, but it's actually not as different a number of GPUs as what was used to train Llama 70 billion originally. However, also keep in mind that DeepSeek, they're pretty good at marketing. They are, and I want to say that first before I get into the consequence of it. They're pretty good at marketing and making it seem like they've done something amazing, and they've done a lot of technically amazing stuff. But they were also one of OpenAI's largest customers, scraping the data. And I want to point out that when others were training their models and they had 14 or 15 trillion tokens, they were training on 14, 15 trillion tokens, which was largely the dregs of the internet. Right? So they had a harder time, right? So you start from better data, you get a better model. Now, why is this so consequential? We cannot do closed models anymore and be competitive. Open always wins. Linux won, and Linux won in a time when people didn't believe in open source. They thought it was insecure, they thought it was going to be bug-riddled, they thought it was going to eat your data, and it still won. Now everyone accepts open. So open models will win.
And here is instead the more legal approach taken by Mistral AI.
With dedicated people, and I think they exist in Europe. We have great talent there, but they also exist in many other parts of the world, including in the Middle East, including in Saudi Arabia, with whom we're working. And so the approach we've taken was to show that. The approach we took, since we want to promote a more decentralized approach where every actor has access to its own AI, makes its own choice regarding how it behaves and how it works, we promoted open source models, just to show that these models were actually harmless. And I think we've showed in 2 years of existence that they haven't been used for harmful purposes, and that more importantly, they contributed to to lowering the barrier of entrance, to making interesting technology on top of it. If you start from an open source model today and you want to put new capacity in a certain language, in Arabic for instance, it's much easier if you have access to very good open source models because you start from a certain level of intelligence and you can bring your own expertise. So that applies to language, that applies to culture that you will be able to put into the models themselves. That also applies to specific expertise that the industry may have.
Mistral AI CEO also provides details about how he's able to keep costs low.
Just diving it a little deeper, how do we make it cheap? So you make algorithmic changes to have the smallest models possible. You work on the software, you work with hardware makers, you actually work with new hardware makers to reduce the energetical cost and to make sure that you're leveraging the hardware as much as possible. So that's a software, that's a lot of R&D to do, and that's something we've been investing on. Something that we've released in particular are edge models, so models that can be deployed on device. If you do that, you're actually removing, you're alleviating the cost that is carried by data centers, and so that's one of the approaches that you can have. And then when it comes to making it controllable, this is everything related to being open source, taking the software and putting it in the hands of our customers so that they make their own custom AI systems, and we do disappear from the loop and we ensure that they have full privacy. Actually, that's very important. It's important because we need to reduce the interdependencies we have, because we do live in a world where interests are not always aligned, and we think that to build resilience in every country, every country should have its own AI strategy. Every country should have sufficient ownership on the AI stack to make its own choice and to build its new soft power as well, because it's also about there's some cultural aspect to it. The way your AI systems are going to behave also tells of the value you want to promote within your country. So that's I think the way we approach it. It's very much of a technological problem. On the education part, it's slightly a technological problem as well, because we need to come up with the right interfaces, the delightful interfaces that are going to make everyone in a country like using AI. Everyone in a school use this tool to learn faster. So there's a lot of UX aspects also. It's not only about software, deep software, science. It's also about the interface, the design, and the design needs to be adapted to the different part of the world in which you are, because it's different languages. Sometimes you read from left to right, from right to left, and that creates a lot of differences that we need to address. And so that's why, again, the decentralization is not only about the models, it's also about the way you distribute it, because these vary, and it should vary within different countries. We've been showing through actual achievements that the benefits of being more open, of being more decentralized, of working with everybody in the world were actually super important and shouldn't be given up for risk reasons, I would say. And now,
there are other advantages by going open source, according to the founder of Mistral AI, and we have heard about these advantages also in a previous video about the approach taken by Meta, and you can watch it at the link above. As we said at the beginning, IBM CEO Arvind Krishna was part of the panel, and he basically shared the same views about open source models. Take a listen.
Number one, we need to keep this technology open. We are at the very, very early stages. For some regulator to pick who's a winner, even if accidentally, would be a problem. So focus deeply on how open you can keep it and how do you allow lots and lots of innovation to happen.
The IBM CEO then talks about the regulations. Here are his views.
If you lead to too much heavy-handed regulation, you will lead to what I would call regulatory capture. And one should wonder whether some of the players talking about heavy-handed regulation, it benefits them if it leads to regulatory capture of only a few people. And it all comes down to, are you talking about an over-increase in the amount of investment? Actually, I would point to Mistral and say that's a counterbalance, because people now say hundreds, they were talking it takes multiple billions, but you guys did it with quite a bit less than that. So human ingenuity, yes, with deep skills and deep training and all that, could get over those things. I think it's incredibly important that we have hundreds of companies innovating in this, because it's also important for sovereignty. I'll use that word. Saudi Arabia is not going to give up on having some of their own models, whether it's for language or whether it's for some of their unique purposes. The minister talked about 20% of global energy comes out of there. That's an area that's increasingly important to them, as, by the way, are urban hotspots and many other things. For France, whether it's defense, whether it's aerospace, there's many areas where they will want to have their own, not just a horizontal tech company. I think you got to maintain that freedom. Then you say, well, but you can do that. Well, not really if at the bottom layer you need permission from a provider of a base model. So that is sort of my perspective. If I could jump on Arthur's point, I do agree that the onus should lie on the deployer of the application, not the developer of the model. Where one has to get careful, though, is if one says that's an auditable process, a regulator will immediately jump to, it's not a self-audit, I need a third-party audit.
Correct.
The estimate is there's 1 billion applications. Okay, put the costs in. If you're going to go spend $100,000 on an external audit for 1 billion applications, that's 100 trillion. Okay, you're not going to do that. I mean, that is what I call heavy-handed regulation that kills it. So it has to get back to what is the risk in this presumed application.
Or risk-based approach on
or
how
you
verify.
accept a self-audit by the person deploying it in most cases. So that is where this is extremely important, or it doesn't work. I mean, your vaccine example, let's just point out, what is the cost to get a vaccine through the FDA? You're talking about $1 billion.
Yeah, huge.
So
And that's why I was asking
that analogy, I think, doesn't quite work at the scale at which we all want to adopt it. Look, we talk about 16 trillion worth of global GDP getting unlocked with AI. If you put that heavy a burden, it's not going to get unlocked. And I think that we all need that, given some of the other challenges we all have in front of us.
Arvind Krishna too had something to say about the cost of developing a model. And once again, his views sound just like the goals and results accomplished by DeepSeek. Let's listen.
Take a completely technologist opinion to how do we get things to be much more inclusive and get billions to embrace it. One simple example from 30 years ago. When mobile phones first came around the globe, it cost $1 a minute to make a phone call when you were in the US or in France, circa mid-1990s. By the 2005 time period, countries like India and some countries in Africa were doing it for 1% of that number. So technologists have to go focus on how do you drive the cost down, not with a subsidy, still making a profit, but drive it down, because if you can bring it there, then the whole world can participate in those technologies and the benefits. So take AI. How can we make model deployment first, literally at 1% of today's cost? Focus on the complete stack. What is the power requirement? Why does it have to be so high? It's interesting. All of you are taking it for granted that it has to be so high. Nowhere is it written in the laws of physics it has to be this high. It can literally drop to 1% of what it is. I know, because Abdullah is investing in some companies like that, right? It is not just one player. There's many others. Two, when you look at model training, why does it have to take so long? Can one have alternate techniques? They proved one a few years ago, but there's many others that could be done. By the way, can you start with a base model and incrementally add what's needed for a country, a domain, an industry in a very small way? So the approach we will take is let's focus on those aspects. Can I drive it down to be 100 times cheaper? I'll tell you, I have 30 times line of sight. I need 3 more. So the first big part is done. That will make it inclusive, and that is what will get it done. Then my hope is that these frameworks allow us to go work in each of these countries and industries.
Now, when a powerful AI model gets into the hands of many people, there are risks that need to be taken into consideration. And as a result, speakers at AI conferences spend hours upon hours talking about safety and rules. The AI sessions at Davos were no exception. Arvind Krishna reminded us that IBM has a history that is more than 100 years old, so IBM might know a thing or two about the role of governments in these situations. Here is the opinion of IBM CEO.
I believe that regulation should try to be light touch. I use the example, is it a scalpel or is it a sledgehammer? And too often regulation, even if legislation desires it to be a scalpel, when it gets into the implementation of the actual regulators, it becomes a sledgehammer. And that's a problem because that is friction that slows down innovation. Capital and brains will then flow to places where it is easier to make progress because these are mobile. The capital as well as smart people can pick and choose where they want to work. I offer a very simple framework on how to think about this. Take a risk-based approach. 90% of what is to be done does not have a lot of risk in it. Allow that to happen with a very, very light touch. Then focus your heavy-handed approach only on those cases where there is extreme risk, where you can say there is a nation-level risk or there is risk to life and death. Keep it reserved for only those aspects. And lastly, this will sound strange because we also develop models, but I would turn around and say, hold model developers accountable for what they are producing. A lot of subtlety in there, lots of words to be there, because then you'd say, well, what does accountable mean? Somebody could misuse it. I got it, but then how clear are you about what those guardrails are that you have put in? So do hold developers responsible. And from a tech vendor, I know that sounds strange. Tech people normally run and want complete immunity and no liability. And so I often just offer that as a framework to think about it.
As we have seen, the wishes of Mistral AI of a powerful, low-cost model available open source came true with DeepSeek. So let's see now what the French startup wishes in terms of safety and regulation. With its track record, the CEO's wishes might come true again.
When it comes to governance, I think the way we should think about governance of is in controlling applications and making sure that applications we make on AI actually behave as we want them to behave. So that's very much an evaluation problem. That you design a model, you connect it to data, you connect it to tools, you give it instructions, and you want it to behave in a certain way. You want it to give, for instance, healthcare advices to physicians. But before deploying it, you obviously want to make sure that this works. Because if it only works 80% of the time, it means that 20% of the time you will make a bad decision. And this is actually a hard problem. This is a scientific problem. You need to evaluate. You need to come up with automated way of evaluating. You need to come up with processes to get humans to evaluate the technology. And I think that's actually the crux of what we should be doing when it comes to governance. We should make sure that whatever is put into production, whatever is exposed to end users, is actually well controlled. I think where we can all agree with our US friends, with everyone in the world, we can all agree on a way to evaluate things, on a way to decide whether the software we've been making, because we're really building software, this is not really different from previous cycles. We need to agree on how do we decide that the software we've made is working. And for me, and I think that I would differ a little bit from your approach to model, although this is probably linked, I think we really need to focus on the application side, because what matters is the systems that you put into place. It's not, the model is really a part, it's an engine. When you validate a car, when you ensure that the car is safe, you ensure the entirety of the car. You don't look only at the engine. Today, the technology is working well enough on certain use cases. We should deploy it to population. They should adopt it. That's very important. But tomorrow, it's going to get more and more complex as we move into agentic behavior, etc. And there, we do need to think more about how we evaluate. Every one of us in the industry should think about it. I think eventually we'll come up with ways that converge and that can be implemented at the global level.